The sun had barely slipped behind the distant hills of Lone Mesa, leaving the sky aflame with the dying hues of day, painting the West Texas autumn in shades of fire and gold. The land, dry and windswept, seemed to hold its breath as dusk settled over it like a quiet promise of the cold night to come. Inside the humble log cabin on the rim of the mesa, Rachel Garrett worked by the hearth, coaxing a small fire to life. The wind whispered through the gaps in the shutters, biting at the edges of the room. She wore her late husband's worn flannel coat over her simple dress, sleeves rolled up, her hands raw from a morning's chores. As the flame flickered and the warmth began to spread, a sudden knock sounded on the door, quick, desperate, and unfamiliar. Rachel froze, her hand instinctively reaching for the rifle resting against the wall. Another knock came, louder this time. The voice, cracked and pleading, sliced through the evening air. "Please, milk my son, he is dying." For a moment, Rachel stood frozen, her heart hammering in her chest. Slowly, she unlatched the door, her breath catching in her throat. Standing in the dim light of the porch was a tall Apache man, his broad shoulders tense with exhaustion, his hair pulled back with a leather thong. His eyes were dark, unblinking, his face drawn tight with pain. In his arms, wrapped in a tattered blanket, was a child, small, pale, and barely breathing, his lips cracked, his eyes shut in desperate pain. A collective murmur rose from a small group of townsfolk gathered across the field, lanterns in hand, eyes filled with suspicion and fear. "An Apache!" one woman hissed, her voice tight with fear. "Don't let him in." But Rachel's gaze didn't waver from the baby. She could see the ribs beneath the thin cloth, his chest heaving with each shallow breath. Without hesitation, she stepped forward. "Give him to me," she said gently. The warrior hesitated, his eyes flickering between her and the child in his arms. "I have milk," Rachel added, her voice steady despite the fear that clawed at her insides. "He will die out here." With a slow, solemn nod, the man passed the child into her arms. His movements were careful, as if he feared that any sudden motion might break something delicate. Rachel cradled the baby close to her chest, his tiny form trembling in her arms as she carried him inside. The wind howled outside, but the warmth of the fire and the smell of burning wood filled the cabin with a strange sense of calm. She sat down by the hearth and gently pulled open the front of her dress, guiding the baby's mouth to her breast. The child's lips fumbled weakly before finally finding their mark, and Rachel exhaled shakily, her heart twisting as she felt his breath warm against her skin. Tears slipped down her cheeks as the baby began to nurse, his tiny hands curling against her. The Apache warrior remained standing at the door, unmoving, his dark eyes locked on her as if unable to look away. The firelight flickered across the sharp lines of fatigue etched into his face, the wound near his collarbone still crusted with blood and dirt. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "You saved him," he said, the words heavy with emotion. "You saved us." Rachel said nothing, her eyes focused on the child, who had begun to settle in her arms. She gently rocked him, the fire crackling softly in the background. The warrior's gaze never wavered, but he said nothing more. Instead, he lowered his head slightly, a gesture of respect, as if he understood the depth of the moment, yet lacked the words to express it. The silence stretched on until Rachel finally spoke. "What's his name?" The warrior hesitated, his gaze drifting to the floor. "Elon," he said quietly. "His name is Elon." "Elon," Rachel whispered, the name unfamiliar on her tongue. She paused, her hand gently stroking the baby's dark hair. "No, his name is Nathaniel now." The warrior looked at her, confusion and a flicker of sorrow crossing his face. "But he was born Taklashim. His mother—" His voice trailed off, and Rachel saw the pain flash in his eyes before he quickly masked it. Rachel nodded, her heart clenching in understanding. "He needs a name for now," she said softly. "A name to help him live." The wind outside howled louder, slamming the shutters against the cabin with an angry rattle. The voices of the townsfolk still lingered in the distance, angry whispers carried by the wind. Rachel stood, holding the baby against her chest, her voice steady as she spoke to the gathering shadows. "He's just a baby," she said, her tone firm, "and no child starved on my porch." The crowd didn't answer. One by one, the lanterns flickered out as they turned and slowly disappeared into the night. But Rachel remained, the fire's glow lighting the cabin in a soft, flickering dance of shadows. The Apache man, Elon, stood silently in the doorway, his eyes on her as she cradled the child. Slowly, he unfastened a leather cord from around his neck. A single feather hung from it, broad and tipped with dark red. He held it out to her, his gaze unwavering. "This is Red-tailed Hawk of my tribe," he said, his voice low and solemn. "It means protection for those who give life." Rachel took the feather from him, her fingers brushing it gently as if it were fragile. "I didn't do it for thanks," she murmured, her voice almost lost in the crackling of the fire. Still, he nodded once. "It belongs to you now." She set the feather beside the baby, its vibrant red against the pale skin of his blanket. The fire crackled softly behind them, the child's breath now steady and strong. Rachel didn't know what it meant to carry the feather, or what it meant to be given such a gift. But in that moment, something changed. It was not spoken, but was there, a quiet bond that had taken root between them, a bond that neither war nor fear could sever. A week later, Rachel had come to mark time not by the sun or the moon, but by the sound of knocking at her door each morning just after dawn. Elon, the Apache warrior, would appear, wrapped in a worn wool blanket, carrying Nathaniel. He never entered unless invited, but the child's cries had softened his stoic features. His skin, once pale with thirst, had started to fill out. His tiny hands, once too weak to hold on, now reached eagerly for Rachel when he saw her face. "He's named," Elon said one morning, his voice softer than before. "You named him." Rachel smiled faintly as she brushed the baby's soft black hair with her fingers. "I had to call him something," she replied. "Nathaniel. It means gift of God. It feels right, doesn't it?" Elon didn't answer immediately, his eyes not meeting hers. But after a moment, he nodded. "Yes, it feels right." That afternoon, as the air turned colder and the shadows stretched longer, Rachel prepared a pot of pinto beans and smoked venison. She sliced dried chili into the bubbling broth and made cornbread, sweetened with wild honey she had bartered from a passing trader. When Elon returned to collect Nathaniel that evening, she wrapped 2 slices of cornbread in cloth and handed them to him, offering them with a simple, "For the road." Elon hesitated, then took the offering with a quiet nod. His eyes lingered on the child, now sleeping soundly in the cradle beside the hearth. That night, after the fire had burned low and the house had settled into the deep silence of sleep, Rachel stood by the window, sipping the last of her tea. The moon hung high in the sky, casting silver light over the plains. As she scanned the darkness outside, she saw him, Elon, standing beneath the twisted silhouette of a cottonwood, his figure dark against the night. He was silent, still watching her, but she didn't feel fear. Instead, there was something else, protection, presence. She didn't call to him. She didn't light a lamp. But her breath caught in her throat as if she had finally understood something she had lost long ago. The next morning, when Elon took Nathaniel and vanished into the hills, Rachel went to gather water from the well. When she returned, a small object sat beside the cradle. She picked it up carefully. It was a tiny horse, carved from dark cedar, no larger than the palm of her hand. The horse was in full gallop, its legs bent as if it were riding the wind. Every curve of its body was graceful, precise, elegant, and strong. Across its back was a tiny leather strap, too small to hold anything. On the belly of the horse, etched in careful detail, were the words, "So he will remember his courage always." Rachel pressed the carving to her chest, her heart aching with the weight of it. The child stirred in his cradle, gurgling softly, unaware of the gift left for him. Later that evening, when Elon returned, she held up the carved horse. "You made this," she said, her voice filled with wonder. "Yes," he replied simply. "It is Apache. The horse is freedom, strength. Our people ride with the sky. My son must." The wind howled outside, its mournful cries slipping through the cracks of the cabin's walls. Inside, Rachel Garrett leaned back against a wooden beam that stretched across the ceiling, her gaze lingering on the low flames that danced in the hearth. Elon shifted quietly beside her, adding another log to the fire, his movements deliberate, steady. There was no need for words. They sat together, the silence between them deep and thick, as if the very air becomes something tangible, something that held them together in a way that words could never. In this fragile silence, something was growing, something neither of them could yet name, but something undeniable, a quiet bond, woven with patience and trust, stronger than the storm raging outside. By the fourth day, Rachel could feel the weight of the town's whispers. They drifted through the dry streets of Lone Mesa like smoke, curling into every corner and slipping through every crevice. She could hear it in the way people paused as they passed her cabin, the way they looked at her, eyes filled with judgment and suspicion. She's nursing a redskin's baby, they said, their voices thick with disbelief, raising him like he's her own. She's lost her mind. The words were like poison, seeping into the cracks of her soul, staining everything they touched. But Rachel stood firm. She could feel the rumble of hooves breaking the stillness in the air one afternoon, and soon after, the heavy thud of boots landing on the dry earth outside. A voice, harsh and angry, called her name. Rachel Garrett, come out here right now. With Nathaniel nestled in her arms, his tiny mouth gently rooting against her shoulder, Rachel stepped onto the porch. The air smelled of hay and dust, and before her stood 6 men, led by Amos Dillard, the owner of the feed store. His face was twisted in fury, his fists clenched tightly by his sides. Behind him stood Caleb Nix, Henry Barlow, and 3 other men, rifles slung over their shoulders, ready to strike. "You're betraying your kind," Amos growled, his voice trembling with rage. "Sheltering that Apache, feeding his child. Do you even remember what they did in these parts? Do you forget the raids, the bloodshed?" Rachel looked down at Nathaniel, his small face calm and trusting as he slept against her chest. "I remember loss," she said softly, her voice steady. "I do not need reminding of what it looks like. He is not one of us." Caleb shouted, his voice filled with fury. Rachel stood tall, unshaken. "He is a child," she said, her voice calm, "and he is hungry." Without a moment's hesitation, Rachel walked down the steps, her bare feet sinking into the warm earth, and stood in front of the group of men. She adjusted her shawl, shifting Nathaniel in her arms, and then brought him to her breast. Gasps rippled through the men like a cold gust of wind. Their rifles trembled in their hands, their eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Rachel lifted her chin, unwavering in her resolve. "This child is not your enemy," she said, her voice clear and firm, "but you are sounding like mine." The men fell silent, their words caught in their throats. The tension hung thick in the air, like a storm waiting to break. But then, from the side road, came the soft sound of footsteps. Miriam Quinn, the widow of the town's first preacher, walked into view, her head held high and her gaze unflinching. She carried a small, covered pot in her hands. Without saying a word, she crossed the yard, past the circle of men, and set the pot gently on the front step. "Chicken stew," she said quietly, her voice soft but strong, "with barley for the baby, for the mother." She looked at Rachel, then at Nathaniel, who was still nursing at Rachel's breast. "Feed him. That is what mothers do." With that, Miriam turned and walked back down the road, her head held high, her steps unafraid. The men stood frozen, watching her go. The silence that followed was heavier than the midday sun. Amos spat into the dirt, his voice low and dangerous. "This is not over," he muttered. And then he turned, storming off with the other men in tow. The sound of their boots on the dry ground faded into the distance, leaving only Rachel, Nathaniel, and the pot of stew behind. Rachel stood there long after they were gone, her body still and silent. Nathaniel finished nursing, his small fingers curling gently into her shawl. She wrapped him carefully in the blanket and carried the pot of stew inside. The warmth of the stew filled the cabin, the scent of broth and barley lingering in the air. That night, when Elon returned, Rachel didn't speak. She simply served him a bowl of the stew, her hands steady despite the tremble in her chest. He ate slowly, quietly, his eyes guarded, but there was something unspoken between them, something that had shifted in the silence. When he finished, he set the bowl aside and looked at her. "They came," he asked, his voice low. "They left." she replied softly, her gaze on the cradle where Nathaniel now slept soundly. And the woman? Elon asked, his eyes searching hers. Rachel smiled, weary but resolute. A stew and a few kind words. Elon nodded once, his eyes soft with understanding. Kindness is stronger than fear, but it must be chosen. Rachel reached across the table and placed her hand over his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and surprisingly gentle, bridging the gap between two worlds. The fire crackled softly behind them, the embers dancing against the dark walls of the cabin. Outside, Lone Mesa still watched, its judgment lingering like a restless ghost. But inside, the cabin had changed. A mother, a child, and a man forged by war sat together, bound by the quiet courage to choose love over fear. It was just after dusk when the last of the light had stretched thin across the dry grass, and the wind began to change. Rachel felt it first, the silence that swept across the land, the way the crickets ceased their song, the way Nathaniel stirred in his cradle, whimpering not from hunger, but from something deeper. It was as if he, too, could sense a tremor beneath the earth. Elon was by the fire, sharpening a tool blade. He paused, his head lifting, listening. Boots, horses, voices. Then came the pounding on the door. Rachel Garrett. A voice called, urgent and full of anger. You got one chance. Open up. Rachel stood slowly, her heart thudding against her ribs. Elon was already at the door, his tall frame silent and imposing. He stepped aside when she reached for the latch. Let me open it, she whispered. Elon stepped back, his eyes dark but steady. Rachel unlatched the door and opened it to reveal Amos Dillard, flanked by 6 men, including Ethan Cole, his long rifle slung across his chest. Amos's face was twisted in fury, his eyes darting between Rachel and the shadow of Elon behind her. I warned you, Amos growled, his voice thick with righteous anger. And now you've left us no choice. Ethan stepped forward, his hand outstretched toward the Apache and the child. But Rachel didn't flinch. Elon stepped forward, his presence filling the doorway, his chest rising slowly. His eyes never left the man, unblinking, unyielding. You do not belong here, Amos spat, his voice full of venom. You do not belong to her. You do not belong to that child. Elon said nothing. His silence was more unsettling than any shouted threat, more powerful than any drawn blade. Ethan's lip curled. Say something, savage, or are you too much of a coward to face what's coming? Still, Elon said nothing. He stepped forward, just one step, until he was standing directly between Rachel and the men. His chest rose slowly, his eyes unwavering as he faced them. Ethan lunged, his hand reaching for the child, or perhaps to push past Elon. But before he could even touch him, Elon caught him by the wrist with single, unflinching motion. With a twist, he brought Ethan to his knees, the rifle clattering to the ground with a loud thud. The other men stood frozen, eyes wide, unsure what to do. Elon's gaze never wavered. You do not own this child, Elon said, his voice low but carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken truths. You never will. He looked at Rachel, then back at the men. She is his mother, and I am his father. Rachel's breath caught in her chest. The fire crackled softly behind them. The room felt too small, too fragile, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Ethan, seething, pulled back his arm, but he stayed on his knees, his face contorted with rage. Amos, after a long pause, took a step forward, then stopped, his mouth opening and closing, unsure of what to say. You'll regret this, he hissed. All of you. Rachel stood taller, her voice steady and firm. You are not the law here, Mr. Dillard, and neither is your fear. Amos stared at her, then at Elon. Finally, he turned and stormed off, the other men following, Ethan muttering curses under his breath as he rubbed his wrist. The fire crackled softly, sending sparks into the night. As they sat together, 2 people scarred by loss but not broken. Not anymore. Rachel folded the cloth carefully, tucking it into the folds of her skirt, her hands trembling ever so slightly as she did. I will keep it safe, she whispered, a promise that held more weight than words could ever express. Something shifted in Elon then, a quiet tension in his shoulders, a deepening in his gaze. Slowly, his hand, rough and callous from years of hardship, rose and laid itself gently over hers, resting on his leg. His voice, low and thick with emotion, broke the stillness. "You gave my son a name," he said, his words heavy with gratitude, as if they carried a weight far beyond the simple act of naming. "You gave us both a place." Rachel swallowed, the ache rising in her chest, catching in her throat. She was about to speak, his name on her lips, when Elon reached for something around his neck, a cord tied with small, worn beads. With a fluid motion, he untied it and placed it in her hand. It was a necklace, strung with dried and polished corn kernels, each one glowing softly with a golden sheen, interspersed with bits of turquoise and carved wood. At the center was a single white seed, round and perfect. "For you," Elon said quietly, his voice thick with something deeper than pain. "So the land will remember. You are part of it now." Rachel stared at the necklace, its beauty overwhelming in its simplicity. She let out a breath, barely audible. "It's beautiful." Her fingers traced the delicate shapes of the beads, the smoothness of the corn, the weight of the stone. "What does it mean?" she asked softly. Elon's eyes softened as he spoke, his voice steady, carrying a deep reverence. "Corn is life. It grows from the earth, feeds the people, connects the past to the now. This one," he touched the white seed, "is rare. It means blessing, continuation." Rachel closed her fingers around the seed, pressing it to her chest, feeling the weight of its meaning settle deep within her. "And you would give this to me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Elon nodded, his eyes intense yet gentle. "You are not just feeding my child," he said. "You are planting something that will live longer than either of us." Tears filled Rachel's eyes, the enormity of his words sinking in like the weight of the earth beneath them. She didn't speak for a long time, just let the silence stretch between them, filled with all the things they didn't need to say. Finally, her voice broke through, quiet but firm. "Then I will wear it proudly." She placed the necklace around her neck, the cool weight of it resting against her collarbone, warm from Elon's touch. It felt light, but there was a strength in it, a strength she hadn't known she was capable of. Outside, the wind rustled the grasses. Nathaniel stirred in his sleep, then settled again. Elon leaned back in his chair, his breath slowing as the fever finally receded from his body. Rachel curled on the floor beside him, her head resting lightly against his knee. "We'll plant in the spring," she murmured, her voice soft but sure. "Corn, beans, squash. The three sisters, like your people grow." He looked down at her, his expression softening. "And Nathaniel will grow strong with them." A smile touched Rachel's lips. "I carve his name into the beam tonight," she said, her fingers brushing the floor beneath them. "So this house will remember." Elon closed his eyes, the corners of his mouth twitching upward. "It already does." They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling, the moonlight slipping through the window, the only sound the soft rhythm of their breath, their hope, their healing. Rachel's fingers curled around the necklace at her throat, feeling the coolness of the seed against her skin, and deep inside her soul, something had rooted. Not just love, but belonging. Tomorrow, the world might knock on their door again with its judgment and fear. But tonight, there was only warmth. Warm from the fire, warm from the family they were building, warm from the knowledge that they had chosen one another. A new family had been born, not from blood, but from courage, and it would not be forgotten. Not by the land, not by the stars, and certainly not by the hearts that chose it. It was just as the sun began to set that Miriam's warning came, her voice breathless with urgency. "They are coming tonight," she said. "Amos will not wait." Rachel's heart skipped a beat as she hurriedly packed a knapsack, Nathaniel's blankets, a small loaf of bread, some jerky. Elon wrapped a sturdy leather sling around the baby's cradle, and together they slipped out into the night. The moonlight streamed through the doorway of their cabin, frail but guiding. They moved quickly and silently, Rachel clutching Nathaniel close to her chest, Elon crouched low with his rifle. The world felt vast and endless as they made their way toward the timberline, the brittle grass beneath their feet crackling as they moved. The forest loomed ahead of them, a cathedral of shadowed trunks and hushed silence. Elon led them deeper into the trees, the old, gnarled trunks muffling their passage. Owls hooted in the distance. Nathaniel whimpered once, and Rachel hushed him, breathing hope into his tiny lungs. They reached the creek, half frozen in the late season, a ribbon of silver winding through the rocks. Elon paused, then signaled for Rachel to follow. They climbed a steep path upward, out of the valley, Nathaniel drifting into a light sleep, wrapped close to Rachel's chest. Just beyond the creek, the moonlight caught the gleam of a rifle barrel. Shapes, dozens of them, tents on the bank. Amos and his men had drawn a trap. Elon pressed Rachel back against a mossy stump, his rifle raised, his eyes cold steel. "Stay," he whispered, voice firm. "Protect him." Amos stepped forward, his sneer cutting through the night like a knife. "Come on out. Apache and the white woman and brat will send you packing." Elon's knuckles whitened around the rifle stock. Rachel's breath hitched in her chest as she pulled Nathaniel closer, closing her eyes. Her heartbeat thundered in her ears, but in those moments, as she thought of the necklaces, the turquoise, the carved name overhead, and the life they were building, her courage rose like the dawn. Then a shot rang out, not from Amos's side, but from behind them. A fiery flare of torchlight illuminated the clearing. A tall figure emerged from the shadows, Reverend Jonas Clay, followed by a man wearing a federal badge. "Sheriff Valid," he said briskly, his voice firm. "Federal Marshal." Rachel blinked through the tears that had welled in her eyes, her breath catching in her throat. Elon lowered his rifle slightly, a weariness crossed his face, but with hope beginning to spark in his chest. Reverend Clay stepped forward, his voice ringing in the quiet night. "Back off, Amos. This family is protected." Amos squinted toward them, shock and fury twisting his features. "This is a ranger's territory. They lost that war," the marshal replied, his voice calm, unwavering. "This child, his mother, and his father are under federal protection. One step further, and you'll take on the United States." A murmur ran through Amos's men. Amos spat on the ground, his voice low, filled with venom. "We will remember this," he promised, but he turned, motioning to his men. "Won't see the last of us." The marshal raised his hand, a final warning. "Leave now, and consider this your only warning." Amos glared at Rachel, at Elon, then back at the marshal. With a final sneer, he turned and retreated, his boots slapping the dirt, the camp lanterns bobbing as they vanished into the night. Rachel stood there, a deep breath filling her lungs as the tension melted away. The moonlight returned fully, bathing the clearing in silver light, and the forest seemed to sigh with relief. Reverend Clay approached, his coat dusted with leaves and frost. "Are they hurt?" he asked, his voice soft with concern. Elon knelt beside the creek, his left thigh torn by the deer he had carried back from a hunt. Rachel's heart twisted as she watched him, but her eyes never left him. It had been a year since that night by the creek, when blood and law had mingled under moonlight. Seasons had turned over the red hills of Lone Mesa, and Rachel's cabin had grown, not just in walls and structure, but in spirit. A garden bloomed behind it now, and laughter echoed from the porch every morning. Rachel had turned the old smokehouse into a school, teaching half a dozen children, Apache and settler alike, letters, numbers, and how to speak with kindness. When the children left at sunset, Nathaniel toddled out to meet them, eager to show his painted pebbles or clumsy drawings. Inside, the cabin had become a sanctuary, a place of peace and creation. Elon had felled tall pines with his own hands, shaping the wood into something beautiful. A crib, sturdy and polished, sat beside Rachel's bed, etched with Apache symbols. Wind, protection, new.